Margaret Foster had never imagined she would find herself standing in the marble lobby of the Whitmore building on a Tuesday afternoon in October. At 53 years old, she had faced many difficult moments in her life, but this felt particularly heavy on her heart. Her father, Raymond, had passed away 6 months earlier after a brief illness. In sorting through his papers, Margaret discovered something that made her stomach drop. A promissory note. Her father owed $30,000 to Harrison Whitmore, the CEO of Whitmore Industries. The note was 10 years old, but still valid. Margaret wasn't a wealthy woman. She worked as a librarian, a job she loved, but one that didn't come with a generous salary. Her soft brown hair, touched with gray at the temples, was pulled back in a simple clip. She wore a lavender blouse with delicate puff sleeves and a flowing cream-colored skirt. It was her nicest outfit, one she'd bought for her daughter's college graduation 3 years ago. She took a deep breath and approached the reception desk. "I'm here to see Mr. Whitmore," she said quietly. "I don't have an appointment, but it's about a personal matter." "A debt?" The receptionist looked at her with kind eyes and made a phone call. To Margaret's surprise, she was told to take the elevator to the 20th floor. Harrison Whitmore stood by the window of his office, looking out over the city. At 48, he had built his company from almost nothing after his own father's business had failed. He had dark hair, just beginning to show silver at the sides, and wore a tailored charcoal suit. His face carried the quiet strength of someone who had known both success and struggle. When his assistant told him a woman was here about an old debt, something stirred in his memory. Raymond Foster. He remembered the name immediately. "Send her in," he said. When Margaret entered, Harrison saw the nervousness in her posture, the way she clutched her purse. But he also saw dignity there and courage. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice steady despite her anxiety. "My name is Margaret Foster. Raymond Foster was my father. He passed away 6 months ago, and I found this among his papers." She placed the promissory note on his desk with trembling hands. Harrison looked at the paper but didn't pick it up. Instead, he gestured to the comfortable chair across from his desk. "Please sit down, Mrs. Foster." "It's Miss Foster," she said softly, settling into the chair. "I'm divorced." Harrison nodded and sat down himself, leaning back in his chair thoughtfully. "Your father was a good man," he said after a moment. "Did he ever tell you about how we met?" Margaret shook her head, surprised by the gentleness in his tone. "I was 26 years old," Harrison began, his voice taking on a reflective quality. "My father's business had just gone bankrupt. I was trying to start my own company, but I had nothing. No credit, no collateral. Banks wouldn't look at me twice." He paused, a slight smile touching his lips. "Your father had a small manufacturing shop. He didn't know me from Adam, but I walked into his place one day with nothing but an idea and a lot of desperation. I needed someone to produce a prototype for me. I told him I couldn't pay him up front, but if my idea worked, I'd make sure he was compensated." Margaret listened, her eyes widening. "Most people would have shown me the door," Harrison continued. "But your father listened. He looked at my designs, asked good questions, and then he said something I'll never forget. He said, 'My grandfather once told me that sometimes you measure a man not by what he has, but by what he's willing to work for.' He gave me a chance." Harrison stood and walked to a shelf where a small metal component sat in a display case. "This was the prototype your father made for me. It was the beginning of everything. Whitmore Industries exists because Raymond Foster believed in a young man with nothing but determination." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "But the debt," she said. "The $30,000? Harrison turned to face her, and his expression was kind. "That wasn't a debt, Miss Foster. That was an investment your father made in my company after that first prototype succeeded. He didn't want any paperwork that showed he owned shares. He said he trusted me to pay him back when I could, when the company was truly successful." He walked back to his desk and opened a drawer, pulling out a folder. "I've been trying to find your father for the past 5 years, Harrison said, "to pay him back and then some. But the address I had was old, and he'd moved. I hired investigators, but they couldn't locate him." He opened the folder and showed Margaret the documents inside. "Bank drafts, letters to old addresses, all returned. The $30,000 he gave me when I needed it most, With fair interest and appreciation for what his faith meant to my company's success, I calculated the amount owed at $450,000. I've had the money set aside, waiting. Margaret stared at him, unable to speak for a moment. 450, she whispered. Your father saved my dream, Harrison said simply. This is long overdue. Margaret couldn't process it all. The relief, the shock, the sudden knowledge that her father had done something so kind for a stranger and had never mentioned it. He never told anyone, she said, her voice breaking slightly. That was just like him. He was always helping people quietly. Harrison nodded. The world needs more people like Raymond Foster. There was a comfortable silence between them. The kind that can exist between two people who understand something important about life and kindness. Miss Foster, Harrison said after a moment, I wonder if you might do me a favor? Of course, she said. Would you have dinner with me? Not as a business obligation, but because I'd very much like to hear more about your father. I only knew him briefly, but he changed my life. I'd like to know what kind of man he was to his family. What made him the person who would take a chance on someone like me? Margaret looked at this successful man, this CEO, who could have simply sent a check and been done with it, and she saw genuine warmth in his eyes. I would like that very much, she said. That evening, they sat in a quiet restaurant with soft lighting and comfortable booth seating. It wasn't overly fancy, just warm and inviting. Harrison had chosen it deliberately. Over dinner, Margaret told stories about her father. How he used to take her to feed the ducks at the park every Sunday when she was little. How he'd taught her to appreciate books and quiet moments. How he'd worked long hours at his shop but always made time for her school plays and parent-teacher conferences. After my divorce, Margaret said, stirring her coffee, I went through a difficult time. I felt like I'd failed somehow. Dad told me that ending something that wasn't working wasn't failure. He said failure was staying in a situation that diminished your spirit. He said I was brave. Harrison listened with complete attention, and Margaret found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't with anyone in years. Your father sounds like he had real wisdom, Harrison said. The quiet kind that comes from thinking deeply about life. He read constantly, Margaret said with a smile. Philosophy, history, poetry. He said books were conversations with the finest minds across all of time. You work in a library, your assistant mentioned, Harrison said. Margaret nodded. For 28 years now, I love it. Helping people find the right book, seeing children discover the joy of reading, maintaining a quiet space where people can think and learn. It's not glamorous, but it feels meaningful. Meaningful is better than glamorous, Harrison said. I learned that lesson the hard way. When my company first became successful, I thought I needed to prove something. Big house, expensive car, all of it. But none of it felt like success. You know what did? What? Margaret asked. Creating jobs for people who needed them. Being able to give employees good health care. Funding scholarships for their children. That felt like success. That felt like I was honoring what your father did for me. They talked for 3 hours. The conversation flowed easily, touching on books they'd both loved, places they hoped to visit someday, the challenges of watching children grow up and forge their own paths. When Harrison finally drove Margaret home, he walked her to her door. Thank you, he said. This evening meant more to me than you might realize. Thank you, Margaret replied. For everything. For remembering my father with such kindness. For honoring what he did. Harrison hesitated, then said, Miss Foster. Margaret, if I may, would it be all right if I called you again? Not about business or debts or the past, just to talk? Margaret looked at this man, this person who had treated her with such respect and warmth, and she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. I would like that. Harrison, she said softly. In the weeks that followed, they did talk again. And again, they discovered a friendship that grew naturally, built on mutual respect and shared values. They took walks in the park where Margaret's father had once taken her to feed the ducks. They browsed bookstores together. They shared quiet dinners and long conversations about life, loss, and the unexpected paths that bring people together. Margaret never forgot that her father's simple act of kindness to a young man with a dream had changed the course of 2 lives. Not just Harrison's, but now her own as well. And Harrison, who had spent years trying to repay a debt, discovered that some debts aren't really about money at all. They're about recognizing goodness when you see it and honoring it in the best way you know how. Sometimes the greatest gifts we give each other are the ones we never expect to receive in return. And sometimes the most valuable thing we can offer another person isn't money or success, but simply our time, our attention, and our willingness to see the good in them. Margaret's father had understood that, and in his own quiet way, he had taught both his daughter and a young stranger the same lesson. Kindness matters. Faith in others matters. And sometimes the smallest gesture can echo across the years, creating ripples of goodness we never imagined possible.